I feel that we go back to power, and as white men who we have power whether we know it or not.
Yes.
And I really feel personally it's an obligation that we who have that power step outside of our comfort zone and use the positional power that we have to invite others into the room, others to the table. And that means giving away, right, some of our power. But it's also meaning that we engage in justice when we see injustice for whomever is experiencing the injustice.
Hello, world. It's me, Dennis, and we are in search of the new compassionate male. I get to be a part of this episode and help Clay produce. Clay Boykin is the founder. And Clay, please introduce our guests today, please.
Absolutely. I've got two fabulous people here today. Most of you probably already know Dana White. Dana's been on the podcast several times in the past, and we love having him here. He, among many things, he facilitates, runs something called the Myth Salon.
Yes.
And it was when you, Dennis, and I were guests on the Myth Salon that we had the opportunity to meet David Huff. David, welcome.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Dennis. Good to be here.
It's so great to have you. You know, looking and learning a little bit about your background, I'm thrilled because of the consulting work that you do, the leadership consulting, the corporate work, the storytelling, and in general, what I want to get into today is, where do you see compassion in all of that? And you know, where does compassion fit into the corporate world? What about leadership, and how, you know, how are people being trained in leadership these days?
May I add something onto
please.
that, Clay?
Mm-hmm.
Of the place where I also want you to go is that we are coming out of COVID unlike the way we went in. Companies are leaner. These jobs are not coming back. People are coming into hybrid economies. They're going to figure out how it's going to be. So the kinds of decisions that leaders must make that are compassionate while still holding themselves accountable to their shareholders is a delicate balance. So those are the types of subjects that we'd like to talk about today. So would you pick something somewhere in there and weave us a yarn?
Wow, no, those are not big issues or questions at all.
Well, we wanted to just start.
Yeah, well, like refer to my notes here. Well, because this is a collaborative conversation, I'll just chime in and have a conversation with you guys and share my points of view and where I'm coming from. I'll start by saying, you know, both Dana and I, we met each other at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and we were studying depth psychology, mythology, narrative. And we were drawn to that, I believe, both of us, because we were at a certain point in our life. Dana was about my age when I met him. So that was about 23 years ago. And I was about Dana's son, Andrew's age when I met Dana. So we were both drawn at a certain time in our life, I believe, when we were discerning and feeling something about our own sense of self as men, and Dana's case as a father, as a partner, and discerning, okay, what is this other piece that we're trying to tap into? We don't necessarily have language for it, but we want some help in exploring it. And it's the fuller aspect of our psyches, the fuller aspects of who we are as people. And as men, right? What does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be a man in the world that we're in now? And how do we, to your points, Dennis, the issues that we're facing, how do we as men address these issues from our own perspective of where we're coming from?
Yeah.
I believe also with COVID, we want to add the Black Lives Matter movement into that. And of course, the Me Too movement that was preceding that, because we're in the midst of a lot of huge social changes.
Exactly.
And they seem to require, I believe, individuals, both men and women, who have a much greater sense of self. And I don't mean by having a greater sense of self that one is perfect or has it figured out, but a greater sense of self-awareness and being able to tap into different aspects of their psyche. So I give an analogy here. when I was in my 30s, I did a lot of what's called contra dancing, which is couples dancing to sort of bluegrassy kind of music. And when you're dancing with a partner, balance and swing is part of the movement. And in order to have a really good couples dance, when you're moving back and forth to music like that, is both individuals have to keep what's called a solid or a strong frame, because one's going to be led and one's going to be leading in that relationship. It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman leading, who cares? But for both people to be dancing, one leads, one follows, but both are strong from where they're coming from. If you're leading in a dance and your partner's not giving frame or pushing back, you can't dance. If you're following a dancer and he or she's not giving energy and frame, you can't dance. So I like this analogy, particularly if you look at men and women dancing together, the different aspects of the psyche. And I think for men and for my own journey, how as a leader, masculine leader from that part of my psyche, do I also engage that feminine, that following side? And remember, the roles can be reversed. Women can lead, men can follow, but speaking archetypally. So within my own self, how do I integrate that in terms of issues of leadership, dealing with the things that we're facing today? And it's a perfect question, because for me, this has really been my life's journey as an individual. And it's that balance that we often talk about between the analytical and the heart, the head and the heart, the analytical or the feeling side. My brother Dan is the assistant health commissioner for the state of Minnesota. So they've been deep in COVID, as you can imagine. And it's been a very stressful time. Last year, with the politics and all, was a mess. He said that since the administration has changed, it's night and day in terms of communication, in terms of support, in terms of guidance, which to me is both a masculine analytical approach, but it's also a feminine empathy approach. So what they're experiencing now is what we might call integrated leadership, is what they need in the midst of crisis. So that's my take on it. The integration of the self in the midst of crisis is how we deal with it. We don't necessarily fix it, but we might have a better time dealing with it. And then I think along with that is we open ourselves to collaboration. And I think that's what your conversations are about, and the four of us here today. How do we collaborate to address these issues? So that's a little thumbnail sketch.
David, as we look at for those of us who are just watching a podcast, I will let all of you know that there is a lot of beige on this screen. So we got a lot of we got a lot of beige here, and this is the time when we, as white men, are having to share the stage, share the leadership, invite others in, and that can come from a place, and that can feel like it's coming out of my share. So therefore, if I invite someone else to succeed, invite someone else, someone of a different color, of a different economic, of a different background into the leadership, that means there's going to be less for me. And we're seeing that as a piece. So how are you hearing that addressed in leadership?
Well, I'll give you an example. So for me, it's always, what is my goal? What do I want to accomplish personally? And then how do I accomplish that? So part of my maturing as an individual, and particularly as a white male, and we can't not address white male privilege in this culture. And I think the four of us are aware of that and becoming more aware of that. And that's one of the gifts, I think, of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's also a gift of the We Too movement before that. And then COVID just shows us that our systems and processes are a mess anyway, unless we work together, right? The individual trying to make it, how do you do that in COVID? So I'm on a board of trustees for a nonprofit here in Asheville, and I'm part of a committee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And the chair of that committee is an African-American artist here in town. She's a glass artist, and she's on the board of trustees. So this is a newly formed committee in order for this board of trustees to do the real work around DEI. And if you do any research, this is an art museum. Institutions like museums have been in the news a lot the last year because they are bastions of white conservatism. And I don't mean necessarily politically conservative, but old institutional ways of doing things, representing white dominant culture, raising money from white communities, and being much more looking like us, Dennis, the beige color.
Absolutely, and the perspective, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
when we choose to what we're going to put on the walls, there's going to be our own conscious and unconscious biases of what is appropriate and what is not.
Well, and even when the self-awareness tells me that although I have an appreciation for art from different people, I'm not the one that needs to be at the table deciding that art that should be on the walls, right? It needs to be the people themselves, who are those people might be. And to give you an example, though, to answer your question further about how are we doing this in organizations, going back to this woman who's the chair of our committee, she starts each of our committee meetings. And when she presents at the Board of Trustees meeting for her section, she starts with a segment of say their name. And you all may be familiar with this. This is a movement in the Black community to say their name of Black individuals or people of color who have been killed by police. So what she'll do is she'll start out and she'll tell us the person who was murdered by police or killed during a police incident. Sometimes they're in their home and are shot or whatever. And then we all collectively say their name. And when we had a meeting recently, I was on a call with her. Yeah, it's very touching. And she said, do you think I should still be doing that? I said, absolutely. I said, our Board of Trustees meetings are full of analytics, financial data, numbers, very left brain, right? Very masculine, very important. But I said, what you're offering to us in these narratives and by having us collectively say their name is soul, it's story, it's human, it's connection. And we're an institution of art. We got to be about story and narrative and soul. So there's where I want to be aware of the feminine voice and that heart voice. And then my role, Dennis, to your point, is as a white male of privilege, I can be supportive and encouraging of my colleagues who are in positions like that. Because listen, people of color, regardless of who they are, they experience it daily. It never stops. They are accosted, they are challenged. I can walk freely on a golf course and not be a member, and no one's going to question me, right? And so they got the gray hair, they're definitely not going to question me. Person of color is immediately questioned. They're either the help or they don't belong there.
The thing that comes up for me right now, David, was hearing you use the word collaboration. The shadow side of collaboration really is the coronavirus. Without people congregating, without people having an instinct to socialize in large groups, this is an outgrowth of that behavioral pattern. And if we're not really careful, this thing is not going to subside anytime quickly, because our the behavioral problems that caused it have got to be remedied. And there have to be changes that come about as a result of solving the problem with a different set of parameters than we created the problem with. And congregating is really a false sense of finding our identity in large collective situations. And I'm of a feeling that we need to kind of be looking for more of this inward journey stuff. The thing that we go to sleep with at night that kind of gets us going and figures out who we are and what we're doing and how we authenticate who we are in our own lives, that is apart from that collaboration. Now, I'm not saying that collaboration doesn't produce strength. Without collaboration, you don't have synergy, you don't have relations. I mean, they're all the good stuff that comes out, but there are shadows. Every time there's a light, we want to be careful that the shadow that we're stepping into is not the one of our own making, because our shadows, the things that we put out there ourselves, create huge blind spots for us. And right now, as a white culture, I think we're fighting for air. And I sense a sense of desperation throughout the country as what we're looking for in the white culture. We're not hearing the solutions come out about how we engender a sense of humility, a sense of compassion. And as you say, David, these people of color and non-males, they have this stuff happen to them all the time. So I don't know where we go, but we can start with humility.
Well, it is. It's an awareness. And I think it's also putting ourselves in positions where we learn from other people. I remember years ago living in a group house in Washington, D.C. when I was back in my 20s. You know, you get together for a bunch of people, you rent out a house. And I remember I had a couple of female housemates, and they were sharing that when they walked down Columbia Road by themselves, men would heckle them or say nasty things to them or flirt with them in ways. And I said, well, I've never seen that happen when I'm with you. And they say, David, when you're with us, they don't do that. So we're limited, aren't we, Dana, by not having the experience of the other. We might understand intellectually that it's there, but until we basically experience it with them compassionately at the heart place, we don't have any idea. And then to your point, how do we come up with solutions that are human solutions, right? That benefit all of us. And I think that's the challenge. We also know, both sides of this masculine, feminine psyche to me are very important. Because, if one of the things that I think can often happen to us is that compassion sometimes, in the way I think you guys are using it, it's a verb and it's active and it's a state of heart, but it's also active. What I think can also happen, and I find this with certain folks, is that they might retreat from conflict. They might retreat from differences because it hurts. And so it's a different kind of, to me, that's not a strong place. I like to see the integration where we're strong individuals, but we go out, like you said, Daniel, with the vulnerability and the attempt to connect and collaborate.
Well, that echoes what we talked about last week with Gar Jameson. Compassion.
Gar's great at that.
Yeah, compassion's not easy. I mean, it's tough. And there's no reason. Well, the perception is that it's not, but it really is. I was reminded about what Howard Teich brought in about the solar energy, lunar energy. And when he was talking about that, I reflected back to my time in the Marine Corps. And he said that, the solar energy is the execution. The lunar leads and the solar executes. And when I first heard it, I thought, nah. But then I thought, no. In the Corps, tough group of guys, but it is all about heart. Leadership is about heart. And it's the integration of that solar and lunar energy that it's saying this. It's exactly the same thing that you're saying. It's saying it with different vocabulary. It's the same. It's the same that we hear when Don Frick, the official biographer for Robert Greenleaf, when he was on talking about servant leadership.
Yeah.
When Arun Waklu, when he was on recently from India, and he spoke about wholesome leadership. And it's fascinating. I think this is just a remarkable time that this is coming up the way it is, because in 1988, I was in a day-long workshop in the corporation that I was in with a fellow by the name of Anthony Ipsaro. And the workshop title was The Death of the Corporate White Male. But the thing it was men and women was the contrast. Race had nothing in that day, but it was very eye-opening. And golly, how many years? And look at where we are right now.
Well, it's, I have one of my nieces, this is where you look at how long it takes for things to happen and movements to take place. And, just how monumental this last summer was on many levels in the midst of COVID. But, I have one of my nieces is 16, and I was up at their cabin up in Minnesota for Christmas, and, her background is my sister-in-law, their heritage is Swedish and Norwegian. So my niece made the fire, and it was just the two of us in the house. It's, -20 degrees outside, so a fire is very important, right? So I said, oh, that's a great fire. You're the Fire Maiden, right? Because I'm thinking maiden is, like Vikings and all that. And this is wonderful. At the time, I guess she was 15 or 14. And she said, maiden is a derogatory term. And I went, okay, well, it's not, because I'm not using a derogatory term. I didn't explain myself. I said, it's not, but that's not important. What would you like me to call you? And she said, person. I said, okay, great. You're the fire person. So this is an example I give. Part of it's her being a teenager, right? But also these issues are very important. Language is very important for these younger kids, and identity and how they are accepted and how they express themselves. And it's, of course, we pick our battles with teenagers, right? But the lesson to me in that moment was, it was more important rather than for me to be right, to listen to what she wanted, right? Because what's important for me at the end of the day, going back to what are we in business for, or what's our goal, what's important for me at the end of the day is my relationship with my niece, right? Not about being right or whatever. Yeah. But that takes some flexibility. I probably was feeling pretty cozy in the house, and I was flexible at that moment. I'm not always flexible, right? But at that moment, grace happened and I was present. And I think present is part of it, isn't it? Right. And that's where Dana, and Dana, you were talking about the inward work, the inner journey. Mm-hmm. I know from myself, when I tend the inner space, and I'm much more centered. And when I don't tend the inner space, that's when I'm caught off guard. And my default, maybe this is partly masculine, oldest son, whatever. My default, if I feel like I'm attacked, I attack back, unless I'm in a centered place. And that's a lesson for me, to where when I'm going into a meeting, and it's a board meeting or committee meeting, I'm do my heavy breathing and centering before I enter, so that I can be present. Because when I'm not, all this other stuff about me may be triggered, or I might respond to this or whatever. And then I need the grace of people when I do screw up, because I do that quite a bit. But
David, do you think that the boardroom is changing?
Well, that's a great question. I think it is. I mean, I don't know if you guys are paying or not paying attention, but I've noticed, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, and I follow a lot of women on LinkedIn and people of color on LinkedIn. And I'm amazed at the number of women and people of color that are actually being promoted into CEO positions, board positions. The work still has to happen, obviously, but I do believe that's happening.
Oh, the work is happening, but there are. I work with a major company, a Fortune 100 company, and when I work with their senior vice president, and he goes, we're running this diversity initiative, and we're running this, and we're coming at it hard. We're working at it hard, but yet I look around my senior leadership, and it's all still looks like me. Mm-hmm. So it is not easy, even when it's intentional, to be able to work. Our biases. I mean, this is what I love about the fact of that there are 4 white men on this cast, is that we're in a place where no woman, because this is what the boardrooms look like. Mm-hmm. This was just white men. Mm-hmm. This is the place when people of color, this is what we get. They get to hear the conversations that we have when they are not there. Mm-hmm. And how do we make a different conversation? How do we bring that up? How do we own our privilege? Own that and say, we must find ways to make these changes.
Well, it's, to your point, and to further illustrate that, I think it's when we're in positions of power, whatever organization we're in, that we not only invite in, but then give support and give power away. I was in a meeting with a couple of employees of an organization that I'm also on the board of directors for. And they deal with marketing and communications, and I'm chairing that committee. And I met with them today. We have our masks on, we're socially distanced. And I said, my role as the board, member of the board, and as chair of this committee, is to support you all in doing your work. And these are 2 young white women in their 20s. And I said, ultimately, though, guys, just want to let you know, my goal is to replace myself with someone that doesn't look like me. And that's my strategy, to really build up and then give the power away. because you're right. I mean, we both know this, or all of us know this from being involved in corporate development and training since the 80s or 90s. I got involved in the 90s. You know, we ran through all that diversity training back then, right?
We're done. Check the box. We got it.
Yeah, and in the 80s, all the sexual harassment training, right? We did that, right? So it's very different to actually give the power away. And what we do know we're facing, wonderfully so in this country, although there's great pushback from a lot of people that look like us, the country is becoming more diverse around race, gender, sexual identity, age, et cetera. I mean, we're becoming much more an example of what the world really is. And that excites me, but it's not without trials and tribulations.
Oh, trials and tribute. I do not think we have seen the end of them.
No. Or will we ever, right? It's an ongoing process.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It is the soul is a continually evolving place, but the soul of America, because I think about that as to what was when I was growing up. There was a very specific, and it was easier for me coming from a white upper middle class privilege to be able to see, okay, there is an American dream. This is what people would talk about, an American dream. Now, coming from an upper middle class background, what does that mean? That I do better than, that I get into an upper middle class? What is that? It's hard to define what an American dream is. But then even when you get down to people who say, now, what is the American dream? Let's look at it now. And how do we redefine it? What would we create it? What would this be? What would the American dream be? What would your son, who is in Germany, Dana, and being a photographer, and your nieces, and Clay, the people, what are we saying the American dream is?
I submit that it's not one American dream. That if there is an American dream, it's that each person can have their own dream.
I love that. I love that, because this is the way we talk about it. Because when we talk about, we use a word like American exceptionalism,
right,
which tends to be a hierarchical word that says we do it better than any other, than saying we are the best America that could possibly be, and therefore we are a member of the great global collective and collaborative place, because we are all on this planet together. So it, as to your point, is that words matter. So how we define them, how we talk about them, how we think about them as we come out of COVID and come into an opportunity to be able to communicate and collaborate at deeper levels than we ever did on the other side.
Well, let's think about language. You know, you bring up Howard. The lunar clock, if you will, is irregular. It moves through the year according to the cycles of the moon. And that isn't the way that the masculine part or the solar part works. So human beings invented time according to the human imagination, and they came up with time constructs that followed something that they could set their clocks by, if you will. Even that has to be adjusted periodically, but not as often as the moon. And the moon varies. The moon is one of those that resonates with how human beings are as biological creatures in a biological world. So it affects our juices, it affects our waters, it affects everything about us as being human. The sun doesn't. The sun is a mental construct that creates this sense of chronology. Kairos is the lunar side of this thing. It's an irregular, appropriate time. Things happen according to a more creative way of involving ourselves with the inevitability of time, but not the rigidity of the solar that moves through the day on a regular 60 minutes per hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. When we allow ourselves to be guided by the feminine, which is the lunar, what Howard is pointing out to is that we have a different order around us. We have different ways of becoming skilled. We have different trusts. We have different ways of involving ourselves with one another. And this heals. We don't heal when you say, well, I'd like to have it done by Friday. That's a solar order. But I'd like to have it done when it's finished is a lunar order. You know, I'd like to have it ready in time for something. Well, there's ambiguity in there. And these are the sorts of things that I think people are coming to realize gives us more substance in our lives, more meaning in our lives, more connectivity. It crosses boundaries. It, you know, it has that, to use the language of myth, it has Hermes in it. It has the quality of change and some trickster qualities going on. It's appropriate here, but not appropriate over there. And so, you know, I think language has a lot to do. If we would learn different ways of being and different ways of forming the human psyche and responding to the human psyche, we would see ourselves more as verbs rather than as nouns.
Yeah, I love how you're talking about that, Dana. Yeah, David, you were going to say something a minute
Well,
ago.
I love it too because I love Dana, but I don't want to. I may be mishearing you, but to me, it's not an either or. I mean, solar energy is important. We don't do anything without solar energy.
They're both. They both operate as a yin and a yang.
Yeah,
and together.
And you're much more lunar and I'm a little bit more solar. So that's probably the reason you and I get along so well, right? Because we're not two suns clashing or two moons doing whatever moons do together, right? So, and,
that's a topic for another podcast.
You can tell the lunar energy is my shadow. And that's one of the reasons I love Dana, because he lives in that world. You know, I'm caricaturing you right now, Dana, but it's like, whatever, wherever, it all just falls into place, man. Right. And that's the stuff I need to learn more of, right? Because I'm like, no, it doesn't all fall into place unless you show up and do it. Right. So it's a balance. I think where I'm able to give, particularly with people, let's go back to people of color or women, or better framed, people who don't have power, right? Whether it be in the boardroom or in an organization or in the community, et cetera. I was talking to a woman the other day who has been, I think, mistreated by an organization. And she's looking at, you know, what are her options, right? And exploring her legal options. And because of her temperament and part of it being a mother and part of it being the feminine type of person that she is, she's not comfortable with the action it's going to take to confront. So for me, that confrontation is the solar energy. And what I was able to do from that solar place is say, hey, absolutely. I feel you have been mistreated. I feel I'm going to support you as you explore options to fight for whatever right you feel like has been taken away from you. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's very solar. That's very in your face. That's very action oriented. So I want to just make sure we don't lose. It's not an either or, it's a dance.
No,
and that points to something we were talking about earlier about compassion's not for sissies, you know. Everything.
Hey, I'm going to speak for the sissies here.
Don't
be. I get it too.
Right.
So don't you be putting down us sissies.
But David, your point is, yes, in this example, you're coming from your solar energy, you're coming from your head, and everything you're doing from your head is compassionate. You're bringing what's with that compassion, you know.
It's not the what, it's the how, right?
Yeah. And so that you're drawing on that you are integrated, and we are all integrated to differing degrees, which makes the world wonderful.
And
Well, I appreciate that point because, sorry, Dennis, you were going to say something.
not at all. I was going to ask you to talk, David.
Yeah. Well, I feel that we go back to power, and as white men who we have power whether we know it or not.
Yes.
And I really feel personally it's an obligation that we who have that power step outside of our comfort zone and use the positional power that we have to invite others into the room, others to the table. And that means giving away, right, some of our power. But it's also meaning that we engage in justice when we see injustice for whomever's experiencing the injustice.
Yep.
And that, to me, I think of the image of a Zen warrior, because for me, my image of my own sense of a Zen warrior is, he or she is present, they're centered, they do that inner work you were talking about, Dana. They're coming from a heart place, but they've got a sword on their back. And the sword is ready to be drawn. The sword is ready to be engaged. And that sword can be metaphorically whatever we want it to be. But when action is needed, action is taken. Because justice, what took place this summer was not people sitting on their sofas signing petitions or giving money to some cause. What took place this summer was people in the streets with their bodies, engaging the powers and saying no more, no more, no more, and experiencing harm to their bodies, harm to themselves. So it's an action, isn't it? It's an active state. Like you say, it's a verb. It's being active in these issues of justice. And they're coming from it from a place of heart, right? And it's a compassionate activity. But I feel, and this is, I think, an indictment I have against us as white people in power, is we often don't take that risk. For us, it's much more comfortable to sit on the sofa. First of all, just to talk about it, it's much more comfortable. It makes us feel good to talk about it, right?
Right.
And then to sign the petition, to send some money here, and then we just do that work. But we don't put our body on the line, or we don't do the active work. We let other people do that for us. And then I think why change doesn't happen, and maybe why the boardrooms still look all white and male, is that we white males, we think we've done the work by just doing that activity when we haven't.
Well, I sent you a check.
Yeah. Right. Or I have good conversations, but this is where, conflict. I mean, this is where we have to engage conflict, and conflict's uncomfortable. And I think particularly for those of us that are coming from a place of compassion or our heart, it's difficult to engage conflict. Particularly in interpersonal relationships, right? Because we get our feelings hurt, we don't want to hurt somebody else. So we might retreat or might not engage. And also it's very comfortable not to engage. Dennis Walker, I think his last name is Walker. I keep messing it up, but he's the CEO of the Ford Foundation. You guys are familiar with Ford Foundation. I think it's the largest foundation in the United States. And he's a Black man. He's also a gay Black man. But he's talking about how boards of trustees, the Ford Foundation gives a lot of money to art institutions, that boards of trustees are mainly made up of wealthy people. And he counts himself in that group because he is a well-off person. And he says what happens is that people of wealth or position or power, we build institutions around us that keep us comfortable, and we use our wealth to keep us comfortable and to distance ourselves from the issues that real ordinary people experience. And because of that disconnect, there's no way for us to truly have empathy because we're not experiencing it. But then our decision-making is made in a void. It's disconnected from what real people are experiencing. But it's a natural place of default for people of wealth and power, and wealth in this country is anyone making over $100,000, right?
Sure.
To be able to keep that barrier between us and what is uncomfortable. And the challenge he has, and the challenge that other people are saying is, we need to no longer, if we really want to affect social change, we can no longer use our positions of wealth and power to insulate ourselves from the uncomfortable.
David, that's, again, this is echoing what you're saying. Dr. Karambu Ringera, in Kenya. I've had the opportunity to get to know her and work with her, both in a gender equity and reconciliation environment and in men's retreats in Kenya. And a point that she made, and some of it was a little bit rhetorical, but the point was really good. She said, Clay, I don't want your money. I want you to come over here and let's work side by side, and something greater than either one of us will appear. And she pointed to colonialism. And she said, throwing money over the fence is colonialism, like what you were saying, the insulation. Okay. Yeah, I've done my part. I don't feel so guilty now. I gave $1. No, get out there, get engaged. That's what she said.
And be led by. I'm sure that was part of your experience, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And another thing that when you were talking about, I've got the sword right here. In the example that I shared with the young fellows over there in Kenya was, yes, you're a warrior and you have a sword in this hand. But in this hand is a hand of compassion. And now you're a complete person. And you can show up and you have the knowledge and wisdom to understand the continuum between the hand of sword and the hand of compassion.
And I want to interrupt here for 1 second, lest anyone who does not know Clay's full story, that is not how the story began. That is not how he did not present himself as a teacher, as someone who was going over there to teach them how to do compassion. So set that up, Clay, so that not be the misunderstanding.
Gosh, thank you for saying that. I went over there to learn. And when I started off that men's retreat, I said, I'm a privileged white Western male. Who do I think I am that I can come over here and teach you guys anything? Now, these guys were 18 to 35. After I said that, I got on my knees so I could see eyeball to eyeball with them. And I said, I'm here to learn and I'm here to share so that perhaps we all, including me, come out of here at a higher level of consciousness than we all came into this circle.
And that changed everything. And Karumbu talked about how after all this time from that retreat, the men are still have changed because of the way you set that, Clay. And I'm just so, it moved me, it changed me, it grew me, and I wanted to make sure that was
well. I want to add, if I can get these words out, that in retrospect, I was channeling my father. I remember as a real young, and we were to move to Kenya, and it didn't happen back then. He said, these people fly in and they think they've got the answer, and they go in, and he's an agriculture economist, and they come in and they prescribe the solution. Dad would go and he would learn, why are people farming the way they're farming? What's the history behind that? What's the cultural aspects of how they go and do their fields, and understand why it is before you walk in. And you don't think, don't go in thinking you've got the answer, because you don't. And that was him speaking when I was there.
Well, as we come to the end of this part of our podcast, I just want to make sure, David, is there something that we have not talked about that is on your mind or on your heart that we should bring into the conversation right now?
Well, I'm going to just riff off of what Clay said. A word that he said was share. And that's illuminating for me in hearing your story, because you obviously came into that space with skills and assets. And I think particularly as white people of privilege, we do show up with a lot of resources.
Yep.
But it's how you showed up with your resources, right? Which was key. Coming in as to really in a humble place, to share your resources, to learn from as one member around the table. Yeah. And it seems like the beauty of that story is because of the way you did that, then they were actually able to benefit from the resources that you brought, and you as an individual were able to benefit from the experience yourself. So that's the collaboration, isn't it? So that's a model, man. That's an exciting model right there.
Yeah. And they changed me because it's been over a year and I'm sharing that story right now because it mattered. And that's what their gift was to me.
I'm so, how beautiful. Dana, you have something to say for us?
I was going to not let this session with David go by without talking about David's incredible ability to engender deep and meaningful friendships. When I met David, we were two guys out there in this doctoral program, in this graduate program, and we quickly became friends. And he would come out here and stay with me before he went out to Pacifica. We'd go out there together, and then we'd hang out there together. And then afterwards, we'd come back, and he went home. And it has been a friendship that has evolved over 20 some odd years, maybe, and hasn't always been easy because I can be difficult. I have, I can
be more difficult than you, though.
Anything you can do, I can do better.
And yet I remember we were hiking in Yosemite one time, and I was convinced that he had reached into my backpack or my waist pack and taken my water and lost it on the trail. And I was so convinced that we turned around and we hiked back up a couple of miles looking for now you can imagine looking for a water bottle in Yosemite. I mean, this is like a snipe hunt that you used to go when you were camping as kids out there, we're looking for snipes. And I realized that he folds in around my kind of abrasive attitudes that we're both older brothers, so we're both convinced that we're right. And I'm even more convinced than he is because I'm older than he is. So he ought to listen to me. And he heals my psyche. He makes me a better person to be around when he's around me. And I think that good friendships, good relationships, he does this, as my wife does to me. My wife has to put up with a lot of my shenanigans and, my oversights and doing things that I shouldn't do or do badly or one thing and another. That's what human relationships do. Yes. And when we build on those sorts of relationships, everybody is stronger and more resilient and more compassionate as a result of that.
Dana, that I so agree. And thank you for saying that, because I sensed it during the Myth Salon session that however David was showing up, it was a friendly challenge to what we were doing, which tremendously excited me and why it was so exciting for David to be on today. And you filled in some of the backstory and pieces to that picture. And so I appreciate that.
Well, just to say, it's obviously mutual between Dana and me, and I value our friendship, and it's been a friendship. It continues to be one that challenges me and grows me, but I think it's also the love we have for one another. And you've said this, and I've said this, we trust each other with our innermost aspirations, our fears. We never stop growing.
No.
So
I'm very
thankful.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion at this level, because I know that the opportunity for us to communicate and collaborate is now. It cannot get it. It has to happen now. We have to reach new levels and of opportunity in ourselves in order to be able to see that this is a world where we are challenging ourselves and the world to say that there are better ways. And I get a chance to talk with you, David. Thank you so much for coming on today. And Dana, as always, Clay, thank you for your advocacy and your work in the new Compassionate Male in search of this, because it's helping me to search within myself and to search everywhere for it. And I thank all of you, and I thank the audience, and please stay tuned. There will be a post show, and we will see you next time for In Search of the New Compassionate Male.
What a wonderful conversation. And we've just scratched the surface. All the way down the line, everything you were saying was just so tracking, and I say it a little differently, which makes it even richer for both of us.
And Clay, I feel like a kindred spirit with you as well, and would love to continue conversations and looking at ways of collaborating. And I believe, I'm drawn to where the power is, because that's where the stuff happens, and where there's opportunity. It sounds like you are too. And, how do we, from our own position or place, bring influence however we can to shift power, or to make power more, to your language, more compassionate. And I'm all for that.
Boy, I have to share that it was in the late 80s, early 90s. They were dropping me into organizations that were sick. They disguised me as the operations director, as a marketing director, and so forth. And the guys that would bring me into those organizations, they didn't expect me to make a PowerPoint presentation about how I was going to fix things. They knew that first of all, it was an engineering company, and I'm not an engineer. And so I was smart enough, number one, to realize I've got to create an environment so these people can succeed, or I'm not going to succeed.
Right.
That on top of a foundation of servant leadership. And I didn't use these words back then, but I was bringing spirit into the organization. I was bringing that connection. I was bringing heart into it. That's all these people needed. They needed somebody to, and then I went on to, they said, well, we want you to, you're going to laugh at this. We want you to head up the culture change task force for the sector. Right. I thought, oh God, we just sunk it before we started. You never use the C word, right. But I beat my head up against the wall for a year trying to get to this place, but I did not have the vocabulary. And what's heartening to me is that everywhere I turn, all parts of the world, Tasmania, Australia, Rwanda, Kenya, India, US, Canada, Sardinia, we're all saying the same thing. And we're all saying now is the time, and it is happening.
Well, and it's the empathy, I think, that,
yes,
it sounds like you and I approach organizations similarly, and we bring in that, emotional intelligence is another way of talking about it. But I said, then that empathetic piece, and this, I'm sure your experience has been this, when an organization is experiencing dysfunction, it has everything to do with leadership.
Yeah.
And if leadership is coming out of place of whatever its defects are manifest in the culture and the organization. So coming in and helping leaders recognize that, or helping the organization realize they've got the wrong match for the leader at that time, is part of the work that we do. But most people who are trained to do whatever task they're trained to do, or have whatever education they have to do, know how to do what they know how to do. Right. Leadership's role, and the larger leadership group, is to create the environment that supports them to do that work, removes obstacles, has the air traffic control view of the organization and the environment, right?
Yeah.
To make sure that folks can have the space to do what they're there to do. And when I've experienced great leadership in places that I've worked, that's exactly what those men and women have done. They provided the environment for me to be able to accomplish the tasks that I needed to accomplish.
Yeah.
So it's not all that difficult, is it? Right? The solutions are not that difficult. getting people to realize that, though, and work through the stuff
Yeah.
is often where the hard work is.
To move beyond their own personal fears. And I love the air traffic control metaphor, because I was just about to interject. Remember old Herb Keller in Southwest Airlines?
Oh, yeah.
I would use that example. The company takes care of the employee takes care of the customer takes care of the bottom line.
Yep.
And he was able to cultivate a culture that was hard as nails, and they earned the right because they had the culture that enabled them to show up and have fun.
Mm-hmm.
And when the organizations I was in, when they got too serious and, took themselves too seriously and, we got to bear down on this, I say, listen, look at Southwest Airlines. If the culture there, and we feel it, and it's all upbeat and they have fun, but make no mistake about it, somebody screws up and people die. Now, do you think that we can model after that? Can we lighten up a little bit here and connect on a heart level with each other? If Southwest Airlines can do it, we can certainly do it.
Well, that's where, it seems like you and I, the work, I see my work, it's almost like being, a corporate therapist or
or mystic.
Or a mystic, or on a mission from God. I'm a missionary to organizations, right? To bring the good news of whatever that good news is, right?
Yes.
That's missing in that space. And your example, Southwest, is a great example of that.
Yeah.
And that's where the opportunity is. So that's what excites me about this type of work is it's at the individual level, but it's also the corporate level, because this culture, this American, the question asked earlier about the American dream, we are not a socialist economy. We're not even near it compared to places like Australia or Germany. We're dabbling in it again, perhaps, but the social cultural change takes place in the places that we work. I remember working with a plant manager years ago they were in the brake business, brakes for trucks, anti-lock brakes. This was 20 some odd years ago. And he was talking about how he was having to be the referee of social issues at work because the larger culture hadn't dealt with them yet. And this was over 20 years ago. And the example he gave is he was dealing with a sexual harassment issue between one employee and another. And in this case, it was two women. And he said, I'm having to regulate and deal with stuff that the larger culture. So his point was, it's being dealt with here where we work, right? Which is what I think draws me to organizations, because that's where stuff's happening. Right?
It's so true. Well, this for me is an opening to a lot more conversations, and it means a tremendous amount to have both of you. This engagement is helping me put words to feelings that I've had and add dimension and texture. So I'm really grateful for that. Thanks, gentlemen.
All right.
Thank you, Clay. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.